Greetings, I'm Nitish Mukhopadhyay, professor in the Department of Statistics at the University of Connecticut Stores. Welcome to the series, The Films of Distinguished Statisticians. This is a joint program of Pfizer Global Research and Development, the Department of Statistics at the University of Connecticut Stores, and the American Statistical Association. The funding helps us to invite the most distinguished statistical scientists to our university. It also allows us to film the Pfizer colloquia and conversations for the archive of the American Statistical Association. Before we begin this segment, Conversations with Distinguished Statisticians in this series, with deep gratitude, let me mention two colleagues, late Professor Harry Poston and Dr. David Salzberg. Late Professor Poston and Dr. Salzberg engineered this program more than 30 years ago. The first film in this series was launched in 1978. I feel proud to dedicate a conversation with Dr. Barbara Bailar in memory of Professor Poston. I'm delighted that Dr. John Bailar from University of Chicago and Dr. Betsy Martin from U.S. Bureau of Census would participate in a conversation with Dr. Barbara Bailar about her life and work. Now it is my great pleasure to invite Dr. John Bailar to take over the proceedings. Enjoy.
It's a pleasure to open this 21st conversation in the series of Pfizer Conversations with Distinguished Statisticians in memory of Professor Harry Poston. I'm John Bailar. I'm retired from the University of Chicago, and now I'm a senior. I'm now the scholar in residence at the National Academies in Washington. With me are Dr. Betsy Martin, who's retired from the Census Bureau, where she was senior survey methodologist, and our featured speaker, Dr. Barbara Bailar, who is retired from the Census Bureau, where she was associate director for statistical standards and methodology. Barbara was also president of the American Statistical Association, and after she left the Census Bureau, she was executive director of the American Statistical Association for some years. After that, she was senior vice president at the National Opinion Research Center. We're going to be talking about Barbara's life and career and lessons that she may have for other people who might be interested in statistics. Barbara, you might like to start by telling us something about your early years and how you became interested in statistics.
Okay. I grew up in upstate New York, right across the Lake Champlain from Burlington, Vermont, so in a little town called Port Henry. And I went through elementary school there, and then we moved to Schenectady, New York. I was a fairly good student all the way and decided I would major in mathematics at the State University of New York in Albany. And so that's what I did. I took a course in statistics as one of my electives, and I found out that I liked it. So one of the things I looked into then was whether there were any fellowships at places where they were teaching statistics, and there was. A flyer was up about Virginia Polytechnic Institute. And so I wrote for materials, and I applied. I was accepted, and I went to graduate school at Virginia Tech to get my master's degree, and went on to American University to get my PhD, which is where I met you, John.
And that was a very happy moment for me.
Okay.
Were there things about your time at Virginia Tech that you'd like to say something about, people or programs or other things of great interest?
Well, it was a very interesting program then. It was much smaller than it is now. Boyd Harshbarger ran the program. He was a very advanced person. He had no problems with admitting women to his program, though there was only one other one there while I was there. But he gave me free rein to teach classes, do what needed to be done. And we had some very eminent statisticians there at the time. Ralph Bradley, who later moved to Florida, was there, and also Herb David, who moved out to Iowa State. So I had a very interesting time there, very productive. I enjoyed it.
And you went from there to the Census Bureau.
I did.
And how did you make that decision?
Well, I was interviewing for several jobs in the federal government. I interviewed some in industry. I went to the Census Bureau for a job, and they were gearing up for the 1960 census. And it all sounded very interesting to me, so they offered me a job, and I accepted it.
Barbara, you worked on a lot of things while you were at the Census Bureau. One of them was enumerator variance studies and the role of self-enumeration. Would you like to expand on that and say what you did and what impact it's had?
Well, when I first went to the Census Bureau, as I said, we were getting ready for the 1960 census. In 1950, people had done an enumerator variance study, and they had found out that the effect of the enumerators on the data was the same as if you had just a 25% sample instead of a complete count. So they propelled a move towards self-enumeration, which was done in about 80% of the country in 1960. At that time, we decided to have a response variance study to see if things had improved any. So we did do a study looking at the effect of enumerators, and we did find that the response variance had gone down about it was 1/4 of what it was in 1960. So people were very pleased that the self-enumeration actually seemed to be working. Before 1970, we always fiddle around with different things before a census. We were looking at what additional work the enumerator could be doing out in the field. And people thought, well, you know, if they could edit the questionnaires while they were out in the field, it would save a lot of money. And then the enumerators would know immediately what their jobs were because they would have edited, they'd know what their follow-up assignment was. So they did that. And we did another enumerator variance study in 1970 and found out that we had really messed things up because the response variance did not go down. For many items it went up, and it was because the enumerators had the control over what they were going to be doing for their assignments. So that was not a happy set of events.
Now, I know you did some of your early work was on re-interview techniques.
Right.
And it was pretty interesting. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the first paper that I actually was a co-author on at the Census Bureau was on the enumerator variance study of 1960. But the very first paper I wrote by myself that was published in JASA was on the effects of re-interview. And here it was using data from the 1960 census, where we had done a re-interview with some cases to look to see how accurate the data were actually, how much response variance that comes from a person not saying the same thing consistently about the responses. So we had data that were done at, re-interviewed at 3 months after the original interview, and we had some that were taken at 6 months after the original interview. And we had some where the re-interviewer had access to the results from the original interview, and then some where that person did not have access. So what I was looking at was the effects of time on the re-interview, and also on the effects of having a re-interviewer have access to the data, even though they weren't supposed to look at it, what happened. So it was one of the few studies where I actually got results that proved conclusively something instead of leading to more research. One was that it's better to have an re-interview closer in time to the original interview. So the 3 months got better data than the 6 month. And the other thing was that the re-interviewer should not have access to the original data. So unfortunately that wasn't always followed up with. We still, in the current population survey, often provide re-interviewers with the original data.
Why do you suppose it is that providing the original data is not a good thing to do?
Well, because it's hard for the re-interviewers to deny themselves the opportunity to see what was said. So they look at it, and it sort of gives them either a way to prompt the respondent as to what they said the first time, or they just change the responses, but it affects their behavior in any case. Again, it's another interesting interviewer effect.
Very interesting interviewer effect.
One of the things you've talked about over the years, and I found just fascinating, is the rotation group problem. Could you explain that and what you found?
Yes, many surveys and survey organizations do panel surveys or repeated surveys where they go back to the same population. There are good statistical reasons for doing that. It does reduce variance if you put the right estimator together with the data. In the current population survey, people are visited 8 times. They're in for 4 months, they're dropped out for 8 months, and then they're back in for 4 months. So you have them repeated interviews with the same group 4 months in a row, and then a year later, over the same time period, but a year later, another 4 months. What we found is that the first time people are interviewed, they tend to give you more estimates of whether they're unemployed. They're more likely to say they're unemployed. They're more likely to say they're employed. They're more likely in a health survey to say that they've had several chronic conditions, that they have visited a doctor more often. And in consumer expenditure surveys, they're more likely to say that they've spent more money during that first interval of time. And then it falls off. They don't report that as highly. And there are several very interesting hypotheses about why this happens. One, I think, that people think is probably the reason, but I'm not sure it is that people learn from the interview that if they say certain things that they'll be asked more questions. So they avoid saying those things. Another possibility is that the non-interview rates for the first month and the later months are different. The first month has a little higher non-interview rate, and we know that it is higher to find people employed at home to get those answers. However, that does not really fully answer the question itself. The other thing is that they're done by different modes. The first month is always a personal interview. The later months are telephone. And you get a different respondent, a household respondent, on the telephone interviews. You could be getting a teenage kid who always gets on the phone and maybe doesn't know what is going on with the older people in the household. So there are lots of different hypotheses. We've never had an opportunity to really test them in a way that we could pull out the right one. And it may not just be one factor. It could be several things going on.
And could it be also partly due to the role of the interviewers? Could they be influencing this bias like they do in some of the other instances you were talking about?
Yes, they could. And in one of the early sets of data I looked at, they were asking a series of, they still ask a series of questions for discouraged workers. And they were originally asking them in months 1 and 5, the beginning months and the first month, and then coming back in again after 8 months, so it's like another first month, really. And what they found there was that the level of the rotation group bias just jumped. People were looking at the answers to the discouraged worker questions, and then they were changing the responses, especially for unemployed, and putting more people into the unemployed category. So that was a definite interviewer effect there.
And how does this rotation group bias influence the estimates, and what can you do about it?
Well, in the current population survey, there's a very sophisticated estimation scheme, and it takes into account the differences between the panels that have been in the survey and those that are going out of the survey. And by doing that, it exacerbated the difference between the highest, which is the first month, and the lowest, which is the 8th month. And that composite estimate had been used for, I'd say, at least 30 years. Nobody had ever noticed that the rotation group bias was having a bad effect there. So in the next redesign of the labor force survey, that composite estimate was changed so that it no longer has that bad effect coming in from the rotation group bias. So we did learn some things about it.
Yeah.
Well, Barbara, when you have these panels that are followed over time, now think about unemployment. The first time people are in the survey, they report a higher unemployment rate than they do a month later, and that's higher than a month later, and
Right.
so forth. Does it even make sense to ask which of those is closest to the real unemployment rate?
Well, of course, that's what we'd really like to know. And some people say, well, it must be the first month. Other people say, oh, no, it couldn't possibly be the first month. That's just an overreaction, and it's got to be one of the later months. In fact, in some surveys, in the consumer expenditure survey, they don't believe the first reporting period at all. They say the expenditure level is too high. Now, nobody really understands that, and nobody really knows, so it's an ongoing mystery that new group of statisticians can work on.
Well, the National Crime Survey, too, they get very high estimates of victimization rates in the first unbounded interview, as they call it,
That's
because
right.
there's been no previous interview. And they use those estimates to bound subsequent reports, but they don't put them into the statistics because they also think those are too high.
Well, the crime survey has another interesting feature too, which you know well, Betsy, and that's the not only do they throw out the first month's data, but they also ask people how many crime victimizations of different types did you have, assaults or so forth. And then they ask people to place them in time over a period of 6 months. And people have a tendency to place them closest in time to the month of the interview. So you have a heaping of the crime data coming up in the month just after, just preceding the interview, and then it tapers off and drops off, which can't possibly be. There should be a uniform reporting over the 6 months. And yet it's not that way. And I guess that's the thing that they now call the seam problem.
Well, or telescoping, where
Right.
people are recalling things as happening more recently than they did,
Yes.
is one possible explanation. Then,
And again,
Yes.
they don't know what's right. They just know there's too much at one place and not enough in another.
well, to me, this discussion kind of illustrates part of the fascination of working at the Census Bureau, of how you have these measurement problems that you really don't fully understand, and you have to pull on theories from different areas and different disciplines to try to kind of sort them out, and that some of them continue to be mysteries, and we may understand them someday. But.
Well, I think what's a little frightening about the rotation group bias is that it affects every panel survey I've ever looked at. And yet, when you look at what's going on in the survey world today, there's more and more longitudinal surveys where people are continuing to go back to the same groups of people. And they're not even aware that there is such a bias in the data. So it's affecting a lot of different data sets.
Barbara, a few minutes ago you referred to the discouraged worker problem, and I think many people don't understand about that. Maybe you could say what that is and how it affects the unemployment statistics.
When you ask people, what were you doing most of last week? People have a choice of telling you they were working most of the week, or they were going to school, they were retired, they were doing something else, they were housewives, they were whatever. As people are in the labor force and they're unemployed, there's a feeling that they are discouraged after a while from looking for work. I mean, they've looked for work, they couldn't find it, so after a while they stop looking for work. And so people who have been in the labor force for a while and are unemployed are then sort of classified as discouraged workers because they looked, they couldn't find, they dropped out of the labor force altogether.
Mm-hmm.
So the discouraged workers who really just got tired of looking are not even counted in the unemployment statistics.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
However, the Bureau of Labor Statistics does publish several different rates, so that in addition to the employment and unemployment, there is a figure in there for the discouraged worker population.
Barbara, the Census Bureau does a lot of things besides the big decennial population census that we all know about and hopefully all respond to. You want to talk a little bit about the other things that go on there and why it is that there's a pretty substantial permanent Census Bureau that works hard all 10 years?
When you say works hard all 10 years, it's a standing joke with people at the Census Bureau that somebody, when they first meet them, is going to say, "And what do you do the other 9 years?" as if a census could happen in 1 year anyway.
Yeah.
But there is a lot that goes on. There's all of these current surveys that go on with the household population, the crime survey, the unemployment survey, the National Health Survey. And now there's this big American Community Survey, which has over 3 million households per year. This is an enormous undertaking. So there's all of that going on in one side of the Census Bureau. There's another side of the Census Bureau that does surveys that aren't household surveys, aren't surveys of people. They're surveys of establishments. And so there's a monthly retail sales survey where you might notice something in the newspaper that says retail sales are down for this month. And they do an annual survey of manufacturers. Every 5 years they do the whole total economic censuses with retail, wholesale trade, service industries, and the manufacturing industry. So there's all of that going on. The Census Bureau also provides support to foreign governments, which a lot of people don't know about. But, for example, the Census Bureau runs the statistical program for Saudi Arabia. So the Census Bureau has a lot of people. It has regional offices throughout the country, and it has a processing office in Jeffersonville, Indiana, and it keeps all of these people very busy all of the time.
Now, I know you did some research as well on, I think, on item non-response and the effects on the data and how you might deal with that problem. What were you looking at there?
Well, the problem of item non-response has become greater in more recent years. Well, so has unit non-response. People are not as likely to respond to an inquiry as they used to be. But even as they go through the questionnaire, they have these items that they don't want to talk about. And the most prevalent one is income. Income is the most sensitive item that you can ask about, and that includes sex. I worked at NORC, the National Opinion Research Center, on some sex surveys. These were surveys of adolescents, who are very eager to tell you about their sexual encounters. But when you ask the general population about income, you are infringing on their privacy or confidentiality or something, because it has a very high non-response rate. It's about 30% in the last census. And it was funny, I was talking to some people recently, very recently, who told me that they had not responded to the income question in the census. They just thought it was an intrusion.
Huh.
So it's a very common thing. You find it in all kinds of surveys. Every organization realizes it's a problem. They've tried asking it at the beginning of questionnaires, at the end of questionnaires. They've decided the end is probably somewhat better because then you don't get people upset by it. You ask it just before you try to get out the door.
Yeah.
So everybody's worried about non-response. It really inhibits the way you can analyze your data. Most everything wants to be cross-tabulated with income, and here you don't have anything. There are other items too that are not reported, but that's the most serious one. So what are you going to do about it? You can either try to get people to report these things, or you can try to impute for the non-response. And if you impute for the non-response, you have to have a good mechanism. The Bureau has tried over the years with what's called a hot deck procedure, with the hot deck being the responses from other people in that same survey at the same time. So they use the responses from people who have the same occupation, the same education, the same race, so forth, to try to get something that they're highly correlated with income, and try to impute the income non-responses. However, there have been checks of the data, and what we find is that income data, wage and salaries, are probably pretty well reported. But data from other income sources, including alimony, stocks and bonds, Social Security payments, whatever, are not as well reported. And that may be because people don't have the items easily at their fingertips. It may be because they think, well, I'm not going to go look up records, it's too much work. But anyway, it's a significant kind of thing that even imputing doesn't always take care of these problems. You just don't get the same kinds of response.
Well, and when you're imputing, you're assuming that the people who refuse to report it are like the people who did,
Yes.
who are otherwise similar, and they may have a reason for reporting.
Yes. They may very well have a reason. So the interesting thing that came out of this work that I did is I had some papers just on non-response, but there were two papers that I wrote with John on comparing some methods of imputing non-response. There had been some question at the Census Bureau. Some people outside the Census Bureau said, well, that hot deck procedure is kind of an ad hoc method, and I'm sure we could find things that were better than that, model-based. Well, we looked at it, and one of the things we did in our papers was to look at the hot deck, and we found out that it was a very efficient method of imputing.
Yeah, it really is. You know, when you just ignore the non-responses, you're basically imputing the average. But you have a stream of records coming through from this population group and then this one and this one, and two records that are adjacent are more likely to be similar than two records that are far apart. So imputing from the most recent one you had is a good thing to do. It's better than ignoring the missing data. You know, the worst you could do would be to just mix all the records up at random and impute, and then you're back to the situation of
Coin flipping.
coin flipping.
Yeah.
But if you maintain the records in a steady stream with slow change as you go from one population segment to another, it seems to work pretty well.
So I have to ask, how did you find it writing a paper together jointly?
Oh
You,
my.
you did more than one, right?
We did two.
It just barely. We have very, very different work habits. And after the second one, Barbara was really the one who said, never again. Barbara's much better organized than I am, and she'd have her paper written well ahead of time. And, you know, a good time to have people look at it and comment and fix it up and put on a polished job. I'm the sort who tends to write the paper on the plane on the way to where I'm going to give it.
You are.
But you gave him 2 chances.
Well, we hadn't quite finished with the topic, and I realized that I was letting myself in for another exciting experience. But I figured, okay, we'll finish it up, and that will be the end, and it was.
Barbara, another topic I found very interesting is based on the fact that a lot of federal agencies have pretty extensive personal data. Internal Revenue Service, Medicare, Medicaid, other places. Maybe you could say a little bit how the Census Bureau, with its own restrictions on confidentiality of data, works with the other agencies.
Okay, it's not the most popular side at the Census Bureau, because the Census Bureau tends to work with other agencies by using their data, but not by giving them anything back. And it has caused some controversy over the years. One of the agencies that the Bureau works with is the Internal Revenue Service, where the IRS will supply data to the Census Bureau with a lot of attention paid to the privacy of it, and lots of, well, Betsy can tell you her experiences there. But anyway, we match that data to the census records to try to find out whether we've got a severe bias in any of the data. That's how I knew that the wage and salary data were reported pretty well, because coming from the IRS records, it looked like there was a pretty good match. The other sources of data did not match as well. Betsy, maybe you can tell them how it is working with the IRS data at the Bureau now.
Well, I haven't personally worked with it, but I did sit in the area where the people who were working on it work, because
they had to be behind a...
They have to be behind a wall. You have to have special entry pass to get in there, and they have to take special training and swear special oaths about the IRS data. So they put up a very high wall, both electronic and literal physical wall, to keep it separate from all the rest of the data, because there are special legal protections that apply to it, and they really are very careful about it.
There's been a recent law that certain federal agencies can exchange data, but I was listening to a talk by Janet Norwood last week where she was talking about the first case, which she thought it was the first case. I'm not sure that it was, but anyway, where they were matching some data from 3 different federal agencies, and because it's not the usual thing to do, there were lots of problems that had to be settled, and it took over a year and a half to get all these data matched. This was looking at an economic issue, and they really needed to have the data coming from the 3 agencies. It's one of the things that it's too bad about our federal statistical system, is that it is so decentralized, so that one agency has to prepare their own list of things. For example, the list of establishments. The Bureau of Labor Statistics list is different from the Census Bureau's list. Mm-hmm. Now, with this new law, there may be some changes, and I think it would all be for the better. It would certainly cost less to do that.
Mm-hmm. It certainly would.
Do you think overall it would be good to have a single federal statistical agency that serves all of the departments?
Yes, I do, but it's never going to happen.
Is that because of the turf battles?
Yeah, I look at what they have at, for example, in Statistics Canada, and I'm really envious of their system. it's wonderful. They have everything there, and they have all the statistical work, almost all the statistical work, for the whole government. Now, it's a much smaller country, and maybe that's easier to do, but here you just stumble on yourself all the time, and it's really costly.
I wanted to touch back on another piece of research I think I remember you did, which was related to both the topics we were talking about before, about interviewer effects and item non-response. I seem to recall that you did some work that showed that interviewers who thought income was sensitive got higher rates of non-response. So it was a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
I was interested in what happened in the March interview on the current population survey when they asked detailed income questions. And this is the basis for the poverty measures and so forth. It's an important data gathering activity. And what we were finding was that, well, we didn't like the non-response rate, so we wanted to find out what was going on. We did a survey of the interviewers who worked on the current population survey. It was anonymous, but we did get over an 80% response rate from them. And we asked them a series of questions about how they felt about asking these kinds of data and different kinds of things about whether they thought that asking income data in March would have an effect on their asking labor force data, for example, in April when they went back to these households. So we asked them a series of questions, and then we looked at the data and we matched that into what we had from the March data itself. And we found that interviewers who thought that it was intrusive to ask income had a higher non-response rate for income. We also found that interviewers who were really worried about the effects of asking labor force data in the next month, that this income data was going to just depress what they got, and they had been trained that labor force data is the real reason for this survey. So they very carefully decided that anybody who looked like they were going to give them trouble, they weren't going to ask the questions. So we found out, yes, that the interviewers carry around with them something that it's not just the respondents, it's the interviewers too. If I think you're going to be really bad about it, I'm not going to ask you.
So what can you do about these kind of interviewer influences?
Well, that's the hard part. There is, I know when I was at the National Opinion Research Center, we tried to do special training of some interviewers. And they were the hotshot interviewers who would go out and try to collect data that somebody else hadn't been able to do. They didn't have these same things in their mind. They were more challenged that I'm going to go out and get this.
Get it.
Right. But even they didn't always get what they needed. So, but it's something you could probably try to overcome in training, but some people aren't going to do it.
Well, I remember a big, probably an interviewer effect that influenced the data that were coming out of the decennial census in 2000 and the American Community Survey, and it had to do with the race question. The ACS was done by experienced interviewers, and they were trained that if I ask you your race and you tell me you're Hispanic, that's not one of the race categories, and so I should probe and get you to answer in terms of one of the standard categories. But in the census, the interviewers, first, the enumerators are much less trained, and so they tended to accept whatever people would tell them. And so there were these really quite large differences in the race reporting, especially by Hispanics, in those two data collection efforts, even though the questions looked to be the same. The interviewer, probably the interviewer, we didn't have an experiment to prove what caused it, but it was fascinating.
But you must think that the American Community Survey got better data.
Well, it kind of depends on what you think, how Hispanics should be reporting. I mean, if they report as Hispanic, then you might mark them as other, If you sort of press them to say something else, then they might still report other, or they might report white or something. I'm not sure what you would argue in terms of the quality of those reports, since Hispanics can't find themselves among the race categories in the decennial questionnaire.
Well, race and ethnicity are
They're
questions.
tough.
They're very, very difficult, yeah.
And it seems to me they must be getting more difficult as there's more mixing of the population,
Well,
more
at least,
hyphenated Americans.
well, at least the Office of Management and Budget lets you include more than one race category now. So if you are of mixed race, you can check more than one. That's why there was, what, 63 categories of race in the last census?
Something like that. It was pretty overwhelming.
I wonder if it's worth going back for a minute to confidentiality and the strength of the provisions that are in the law. As I recall, not even the FBI can get census records.
The Census Bureau operates under something that's called Title 13 in the U.S. Code, and that prohibits them from giving any information to anyone, including any other federal agency. So no, and no law enforcing agency can come and get federal records. For a while, on the in surveys of establishments, it was thought that because they weren't people, that they were establishments, that provision might not hold. Actually, there was a court case, and again, that provision was that there was great protection. Nobody can get hold of those records.
And is the primary purpose of that is to protect the respondents so they will respond? That you can tell them nobody can get at these records, and they may be more inclined to provide the information?
Well, that's absolutely it, that you have to be able to provide the protection and convince people that their records really are private. And these large companies are not going to put down their information if they think other companies that are their competitors can get hold of it. So yes, you want to be able to convince them that you got them and nobody else can have them.
But isn't there a provision that the census data can be released after a long period of time?
70 years.
70 years.
And then the genealogist can get at it.
Has there been any objection to that 70-year period for making the records public?
Well, some people have said that the period should be extended to maybe 100 years or something like that, just because people are living longer now than they used to. I think there are so many genealogists in this country now, it's just everybody's favorite pastime, that if the Census Bureau said it was going to do that, there'd be an uprising.
Well, I'd like to talk about the research and really the whole effort at the Census Bureau that I think you're most closely associated with, which is the census undercount research. And that's when you hired me, that's what I came there to work on, was undercount. And I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about how you got involved in that and some of the kind of history. I know certainly adjustment came to be a very contentious kind of issue, but there was a lot more to it than just the adjustment.
Right.
And
as I have often thought about the undercount, you know, it went back to the very first census. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson talked about the undercount. Well, that was based on their personal feelings about and what they knew about the country. Different cities and states did sue the Census Bureau over different years, but there was nothing really serious, I think, until people noticed that when they were looking at the records for men who had to register with the draft after the 1940 census, that when they matched those records into the census, that there was a huge male population, primarily black population, that was missing in the census records. It was the first time that there'd ever been any indication that there was this undercount that might be differential. So then some interesting work went on outside the Census Bureau, actually, to try to get measures of the undercount, and this was the method of demographic analysis that you know well. And it showed conclusively that
And what was that? What was demographic analysis? What did they do?
Well, they took the old census counts and they went forward with births, took out deaths, got immigration coming in, emigration going out, and made an estimate of the population. Now, they could only do it at the national level, but they couldn't do it by race because birth and death records have race on them. Immigration records are terrible in any sense. So, in emigration, there isn't any kind of record right now. So they're not complete, but they give a good indication that the undercount is really more highly concentrated in the black population, especially young black males. So that was well known by the time I was at the Census Bureau. And we were coming up to the 1970 census, which was a crucial census because of this one person, one vote kind of court decision. But people were still thinking that the undercount, it must be something to do with the interviewers, or it must be something to do with the people themselves, or the questionnaire. Nobody knew what it was caused by. And actually, because of the kind of work that people at the Census Bureau do, they were more interested in the estimates than they were in the why and the how. So what we were doing for a long time was getting estimates. The area where I worked, the Research Center for Measurement Methods at that time, we had contracts with a lot of different universities and people outside of the Census Bureau to do work for us. And we found this couple who were living in New York City and who were ethnographers. They studied a small group of people to see who was living there. They got to know them fairly well. Anyway, they sent us a list of the people that were living in the area, a small block or two, as I recall. And then we matched that into the census, and we found out who was missing. All the black males. And they lived there, but they weren't showing up in the census. And why was that? Well, when we found out, I mean, they asked the questions, they knew what was going on. A lot of the people that were living in these households, it was a poor neighborhood, were on welfare. If a man was living in the house, the welfare would be cut off. So there is no incentive to tell a government agency, even if the government agency promises that everything is confidential, that there's somebody there. So
they were protecting. It was sort of a form of self-protection.
Yes, and economic protection.
To present a consistent picture to the government that didn't risk any
sort of
resources.
Right.
Yeah.
So we were very interested in that, but found it difficult to repeat that study. I mean, it was hard for us, not being close to that field, at finding the right people to look at different population groups and so forth. And that's when I found you, Betsy, and brought you into the Census Bureau. And you did many of those.
Well, I didn't do them personally.
I know.
But we found people to do
you
them.
did what, about 20 or 30 of them?
We did almost 30. And we tried to station them in places where these researchers were already working and living, and knew the population, and it was in a great variety of places. We were trying to cover various ethnic groups that might have undercounts, or people with circumstances that would lead them to be missed, like homeless people. We tried to look at homeless people too, although That's a tough one.
Oh, that's really hard, yes. The other thing that was going on is that Census Bureau was very surprised after the 1980 census that before the census was over, it got sued by the state of Michigan, or no, the city of Detroit, and then the city of New York. And both of these cities sued for an adjustment of the data, saying that they were really being hurt by not counting the full population. Mm-hmm. And the Census Bureau had not expected lawsuits. Mm. So here we were, a bunch of innocent people going off to defend our wonderful Census Bureau. And naive as could be, we all thought that, you know, all you did was tell the truth, and, you know, justice would triumph. Well, that's not the way it works. And lawyers get involved, and advocacy takes place, and a judge starts telling you that he'll put you in jail if you don't answer quite the way he wants you to. So it got very exciting. The courts finally agreed in 1980, and I was one of those who pushed hard that the census should not be adjusted because we did not have the right tools to use for an adjustment. But you know, how long can you go on being dumb? So we decided we had to put together a program for 1990, and we did proceed with a very good program, I think, at the Bureau. We did a lot of testing, and after one of the major tests, we decided we could make our decision about whether we were going to adjust for the next census. So we made the decision that we would, and our director went down to talk to the people at the Commerce Department that, yes, the Census Bureau was going to adjust. And the Department of Commerce said, no, the Census Bureau is not going to adjust. We're going to have a wonderful census, and there will be no need for it at all. So shortly after that, things got a little unpleasant, and I did leave the Census Bureau. Now, it's interesting to me that in 1990, yes, there were lawsuits about adjustment, but the courts ruled that there did not have to be an adjustment. In 2000, everything was in the right place for an adjustment. There was a Democratic president. It looked like Congress would let this go through. The Department of Commerce was okay with it. And then what happened is that the measurement program itself just did not give the right kinds of data. And the Census Bureau people knew this, and I commend them for this, because I know a lot of them really wanted to adjust, but they knew that they would not be improving the data by doing it. And again, the Census Bureau said, no, we will not do anything that makes the census data worse.
Yeah.
So that was great.
In the 2000, they got a pretty big surprise because it turned out there were more duplicates in the census than we ever suspected. They collected names for the first time and birth dates so they could match and find out if there were duplicate records for the same person. And it was kind of a shock, I think, to find that out.
Well, I think the two of you have explained why the undercount is important. You know, to talk about 1%, 2% doesn't sound like a very big deal. But as you've said, it's differential. That's an average over the whole country. And if some groups are well counted, others may be undercounted by 10%, 20%, 30%, like the young black males. And that's a very serious matter for that demographic group and for the places where they live.
And some people are overcounted.
And some are overcounted.
People like me and Barbara.
Yeah,
Old white ladies. Middle-aged white ladies.
well,
ladies.
I might be overcounted too.
Actually, you were overcounted. You know, all those years when you were living in another city and coming home on the weekends, you should have been counted in the other city.
You weren't even in the U.S.
No, I was in Canada.
Part of it. Part of the
I was in
time.
Canada.
Did you put him on
I did.
census
I put him
form?
on the census form.
Barbara. I'm shocked.
Oh, well.
Actually, it may not be a problem because of the tax relations, the tax law. I made sure that I was at home in Washington at least half of all the nights during the year. I was back on weekends and
This
vacations.
sounds pretty phony to me.
Nope, I assured you, I was there,
Well-
183 nights during the year.
You know, you learn something new in these Pfizer colloquia.
Oh, that's wonderful. We don't have very much time left, but there are a few more things that we might want to talk about. You haven't said much about what you did after you left the Census Bureau.
After I left the Census Bureau, I had been president of the American Statistical Association during 1987. And Fred Ione, the longtime executive director of the American Statistical Association, said that he was going to retire. So I thought, well, that sounds like a fun thing to do. So I was interviewed for the job, and I went on to become executive director. And I was there for about 7 years. We did a lot of interesting things while I was there, and it is an interesting job. In my usual role as a statistician at the Census Bureau, I interacted with people like myself who had common interests with me. I interacted with some health people, but it was mostly about health surveys. I had never really interacted with industry statisticians. But when you're at the ASA, you have industry, academe, and government. And so I got to meet a lot of those different kinds of people, and it was really fun. We improved the finances, we got more journals going, and we made it more possible for people to select the journals they wanted instead of having to take certain journals.
And I think you really laid the foundation for having a modern, very strong association.
Well, that's what we tried. We hope we succeeded. I could not have done that alone, of course. I had a lot of people I hired that were wonderful to work with and worked very hard.
Barbara, would you want to say a few words about the recent budget problems for the Census Bureau?
Well, the government did not pass, I should say, the Congress did not pass the appropriation bills for the government, and none of them have been passed, so that all of the government is now operating under what's called a continuing resolution. You get the same amount of money this year as you got last year. That's okay for some places, but not for the Census Bureau during the time when it's ramping up for the census. They have a big dress rehearsal coming up this year, and it needs more money. They need money to look at these handhelds and make sure that they're operating exactly right before they use them in the decennial. And they were trying out some new procedures, I think, in Fort Dix, North Carolina. Now they aren't going to be able to do those things if the money doesn't come through. And in fact, in an editorial I read just this week, it looks like the handhelds may have to be sacrificed, and they will go back to the old way of doing the census at a much greater cost.
Well, they put a lot of effort into trying to get those handhelds online too.
Yes.
That would be a shame.
Yeah. Well, Barbara, maybe you'd like to close with just a few words about careers in statistics, careers at the Census Bureau, what you see opening up for people who are just finishing their training.
Well, I think statistics is a field where there is a lot of opportunity everywhere. In the government, certainly in industry, academe, there's a shortage of statisticians. So where people's interests lie, I mean, they can find work easily, and it's fun work. I've always thought that being a statistician was a little bit like being a detective, because you look at the data and you see, oh, this doesn't quite fit, and so you try to go to work on it. their fields are wide open. I must say that I would like to get more people into the federal government. There's going to be a wave of retirement soon. And it is a little difficult because a lot of the people who are in the statistics graduate schools are not federal, they're not American citizens. And to work in the federal government, you do have to be an American citizen. So that's a drawback.
Well, we're running out of time, but I'd like to thank you both for your contributions here.
Thank you.
It's been an interesting conversation. I've learned some things, and I think it's just great.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Barbara.